In 1947, a rancher's discovery would lead to a cover-up that lasted almost 50 years. That's right, we're going to be talking about the Roswell Incident. I will discuss the crash, what was found after, and all the secrecy and everything in between. It's going to be a long one. June 14th, 1947, William Mac Brazel, a rancher foreman, was driving through the Foster Ranch in Lincoln County, New Mexico with his son when they stumbled upon a debris field. The debris was spread over a large area, with the parts of the debris being described as rubber strips, tinfoil, paper-looking material, metal parts, and wooden beams, with these different scraps of debris described as being a couple inches to a couple feet long. Mac was unsure of the origins of this material, but he did say he heard a loud explosion the night prior, and that was kind of part of the reason why he was out driving through the ranch area. July 4th, 1947, Mac returned with his wife and daughter in tow to collect as much of the material as they could. July 5th, 1947, Mac was visiting his uncle in nearby Corona, New Mexico. He told his uncle about the weird debris he found on the ranch, and his uncle told him about flying saucers and how, a week prior, a pilot saw several unidentified flying objects around Mount Rainier in the state of Washington. This got Mac thinking. Maybe what he has is pieces of a crashed flying saucer. July 7th, 1947, Mac drove down about 2 hours to Roswell, New Mexico, to sell some goods and to also drop off the debris he had to Sheriff George Wilcox. Sheriff Wilcox also had no idea as to the origins of the debris, so he had to contact a friend. Sheriff Wilcox contacted Colonel Butch Blanchard from the Roswell Army Airfield to get his opinion on these debris. Based on the sheriff's descriptions of the debris, Colonel Blanchard was unable to determine what they could be from, so he decided to contact his higher-up, which was General Roger Ramey from the Fort Worth Army Airfield in Fort Worth, Texas. After explaining the situation to the general, Blanchard was ordered to have the debris collected and sent down to Fort Worth. Colonel Blanchard sent Intelligence Officer Major Jesse Marcel and Captain Sheridan Cavett from the Roswell Army Airfield to examine the debris field and to collect the debris. Major Marcel and Captain Cavett headed out to the site accompanied by Sheriff Wilcox and Branch Foreman Mac Brazel. Marcel and Cavett were perplexed by the debris themselves as they spent several hours collecting them. Cavett felt that they looked like parts of a weather balloon, while Marcel felt that the parts were not of this earth. July 8, 1947, the debris reaches Fort Worth, where First Lieutenant Walter Hout is ordered by Colonel Blanchard to release a press statement stating, basically, that the military had a flying saucer. The news went nationwide. It was exciting, it was scary, extraterrestrials were real, and they crashed on our planet. Or did they? July 9th, 1947, after more thoroughly examining the debris, the military issued a retraction and a new statement stating that they didn't have a flying saucer, rather they had a crashed weather balloon. And then the press was instructed to go to General Ramey's office in Fort Worth, where they had some of the debris on display. General Ramey was joined by others in his office, like Major Marcel and a Colonel Dubois. These people were there to essentially pose with the materials and answer any questions. Granted, when one of the photographers was interviewed after the fact, he said he asked the general what the debris really were, and the general said he wasn't really sure. July 10th, 1947, military personnel at the Alamogordo Army Airfield in New Mexico had reporters swing by for a demonstration. They showed the press an example of a weather balloon that would have crashed on the ranch. They went over how the different debris correspond to different parts of the weather balloon, and then they showed some weather data that their weather balloons have allegedly collected over the past year. And then on July 11th, 1947, at the Fort Worth base, There was another military demonstration of a weather balloon, and that was that. It wasn't aliens, it was just a weather balloon. Case closed, right? Well, the weather balloon explanation and the demonstrations shown was enough to satisfy the media and most people at the time. However, not everybody was satisfied. Those that weren't would go on to conduct their own interviews and do more digging, and with that we learned some more information. Remember Major Marcel? He was interviewed about the Roswell incident some 30 years after the event itself, throughout the 1970s and 1980s, by several people, publications, and broadcast networks. And he had some interesting things to say about the Roswell incident. If you recall, Major Marcel did not believe that the debris was of earthly origins, so it should be no surprise he didn't really believe that they belonged to a weather balloon. And that was for several reasons, actually. One of those reasons being the debris field was spread out over a very large area. It appeared to be scattered in a northeast to southwest direction. And with how everything was scattered in such a large area, to Marcel it seemed like there was an explosion that occurred. Whether that explosion was mid-air or from something impacting the ground, he wasn't sure. But what he was sure of was that weather balloons don't explode. Marcel also said that he was familiar with the kind of weather balloons that the military used, and that the debris pieces that he picked up didn't really match any of the stuff he was familiar with that went on those weather balloons. Marcel described the debris as light and strong, also seeing wooden-looking pieces, metal-looking pieces, and paper-looking pieces, like described prior. He tried to burn some of the material with a lighter he had on him, but nothing caught fire. He also tried to bend and break some of the pieces of debris into smaller pieces, and none of it was breaking. He also said that the pieces looked like they were cleanly broken with no jagged edges, something that was also very strange to him. The strangeness didn't end there. Major Marcel also found an I-beam with embroidered symbols on them that he described as hieroglyphics. These symbols looked like triangles, circles, and squares, and they were purple or pink in color. Marcel packed up as much of the debris as he could in his truck, and he left Cavett to do more collecting as he drove home. Marcel was supposed to take the debris to the Roswell base for it to be shipped out to the Fort Worth base, but he wanted to show his wife and son what he found and how strange the debris looked. Marcel's son, Marcel Jr., would go on to write a book detailing what he saw and his thoughts on everything with the Roswell incident. That book I did use for part of my research. Marcel Jr. described the debris that his father showed him a lot like how his father described it, including that strangely colored I-beam with the hieroglyphics on it. Marcel Jr. noted that none of the pieces that his father showed him appeared to be part of anything electronic, which, if you have a weather balloon that's collecting weather data, electronics kind of have to be part of it. Granted, it is possible that Marcel Sr. didn't bring in any electronic-looking components when he was showing his son the debris. Marcel Sr. didn't bring in everything he collected that day. He just grabbed one of the boxes he had of debris in it and then just brought it into his kitchen. So his son really only saw some of the debris, not really a whole lot. Marcel Sr. would go on to say that they were not able to collect all the debris just because there was so much of it. And then he said something strange. Instead of taking the debris to Fort Worth, he said that the debris was taken to the Wright-Patterson base in Ohio. Perhaps it was sent there first to be thoroughly examined before going off to Fort Worth. Several military personnel and a family of military personnel who were involved in the Roswell incident at the time were interviewed many years after the fact, and they all gave similar stories about the strange debris. In the later years after the Roswell incident, it was claimed that there were up to 3 crash sites that day in 1947. This included the debris field, which is what we've been discussing, but it also included Crash Site 1, which was closer to Roswell in an unspecified location, and Crash Site 2, which was about 200 miles from Roswell itself. These crash sites had witnesses describing flying saucers that had hit the ground that had alien pilots that were dead, later taken by military personnel. You also had a witness who said there were alien bodies at the Roswell Army Airfield Hospital there for autopsy. I will go more in detail on these things a little bit later in the video. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, remember Wilcox? Well, it was alleged that he was threatened to keep quiet about what he saw and what he knew by military personnel. Then you have the secret group Majestic 12 that were allegedly created by President Truman in 1947 post-Roswell Incident. Their job was to study, research, recover, and even reverse engineer spacecrafts. This is a very extensive topic that goes beyond Roswell. I will cover it in the future for its own video. Just know that it was allegedly a thing that happened. For many years, the UFO community grew after this event, with a lot of conspiracies and discussions of cover-ups, more crash sites, more bodies, especially in New Mexico itself, which I know I keep saying this, but there will be other stuff that happened in New Mexico that I will cover in the future. But anyway, with all this growing conspiracy and concern of government cover-ups and need for information and disclosure, the pressure was on. In 1994, one of the members of the New Mexico Congress, along with the U.S. government accountability offices, were pushing the Air Force to comment on the Roswell incident. With all the rumors and conspiracy and secrecy, people really wanted to know what happened, what really happened at the Roswell incident. And the Air Force folded, and they ended up writing out 2 reports. The first report was the Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction, published in 1995, and the second one was called the Roswell Report, Case Closed, published in 1997. I will link these down in the description if anybody wants to read them, and I did use them as part of my research. What did these reports reveal? Well, it turns out, to no one's surprise, the military was lying to us and there was a cover-up. Those weather balloon demonstrations in 1947, along with that weather data that was shown off, that was all bogus. It was all a bunch of crap. The military was just trying to cover their ass. And this is good, right? Finally, we get the truth. Finally, aliens. Except, it wasn't aliens. The weather balloon parts shown were the real deal. The components of the debris did actually fit together to create a type of balloon device, just not one that was used for collecting weather data. These balloons were used for high-altitude secret surveillance by the US government as part of a program called Project Mogul. This wasn't the first secret classified surveillance program, nor will it be the last, but at least for this one, they weren't spying on US citizens. We'll get to that more a little bit later. This secret project was attached to atmospheric research being done by researchers at New York University. The atmospheric stuff wasn't classified, just the surveillance part. And I believe that the whole "this is for atmospheric research" was just the cover that they used to be able to launch these balloons, involve actual scientists and researchers, and have everything done secretly. The military had scientists and researchers from New York University and Columbia University work on various different parts that would come together to form the Project Mogul balloons. They didn't tell the researchers what all the parts were for, and they had different teams working on different parts. And when everything came together, they had their finished product that they were then launching in secret from several military bases, including ones in the New Mexico desert. What was the surveillance used for? Well, to detect nuclear explosions, specifically ones created by the Soviet Union. Because at the time, post-World War II, the Soviets and the US were at an arms race, testing and building various nuclear weapons. Granted, by the time the Project Mogul stuff was going on, the Soviet Union had not yet tested a nuclear weapon. The military would launch these large trains of balloons, about 600 to 650 feet long. All of these balloons being equipped with various instruments for detecting sound of nuclear explosions. along with stuff to allow the military to communicate with the balloons to know where they are and for them to transmit the data that they had. These balloons would be launched, fly up really high, about the ionosphere, where a current would carry them towards the Soviet Union. And because they were able to easily detect sounds from great distances that high up, they didn't have to fly really into the Soviet Union territory, but close enough to areas where they suspected that they would be testing nuclear explosions. Project Mogul lasted from 1947 to 1949. How does this project relate to the Roswell Incident? Well, on June 4th, 1947, military personnel at the Alamogordo Army Airfield launched a train of balloons high up into the atmosphere. Unbeknownst to them, something went wrong. They lost communications with the balloons, and they came crashing down on the Foster Ranch. They weren't aware of this, and they just figured maybe they'll reestablish connection with them a little bit later, or if they did crash, they'd probably turn up. But they weren't going to go around telling civilians, hey, have you seen some crash debris anywhere? Everything was supposed to be kept secret still. And then about 10 days later, Rancher Brazel found the debris, and you know the rest of the story from there. And this is all the official story from the US government. Whether or not you want to believe that is up to you. And now it's time for probably everybody's least favorite section, where we talk about what was fact and what was potentially fiction. Let's start with the Marcels. If you recall, Marcel Jr. said his father, Marcel Sr., brought home some debris and laid it out in the kitchen, and they had a look through everything. And Marcel Jr. had stated that none of the components seemed like they were anything electronic, which you would need if you have a weather balloon collecting data or even a surveillance balloon collecting long-distance audio. And I believe I mentioned this before, but it's important to note that he didn't see all the debris that were present. He got a small glimpse of just some of the pieces. And while some of them did appear strange, like the I-beam with the hieroglyphics on it, which we'll talk about a little bit more a little later, none of the electronical components of these Mogul balloons was present at that point. I did read how other military personnel did find radar dishes and other electronic components among the debris fields, including Cavett, who was out there with Marcel Sr. the day they were collecting the debris. The military explained these electronical components as the stuff that was used for collecting and transmitting weather data, even though not all the pieces really looked like something you'd use for weather data, because it was being used for surveillance. Then you have a little bit of a conflict as to where the debris was being taken. The Marcels, both senior and junior, gave a different answer, and the military themselves had their own answer, which matched up with one of the Marcels said. That being, Marcel Sr. said the parts were going to the Wright-Patterson Air Base in Ohio, whereas the military and Marcel Jr. recalls that the parts were all taken to the Fort Worth base. By all accounts that I read, the debris never went to Ohio, they just went to Texas. And even if you look at the timeline, you're telling me on the 7th, late night on the 7th, Marcel Sr. brought the parts home for his son to look at in the kitchen, and the wife, she was there too. And then in the early hours of the 8th, he brought it to the Alamogordo base to be then flown to Ohio, where they'd be examined for about a day or less, before the following day on the 9th, they'd have to be in Texas for a press briefing. I don't think they'd give themselves less than a day to examine the parts if they were just some kind of weather balloon. If it was extraterrestrial, they'd want to hold on to it, look it over, probably wouldn't want to show it to the public. Though some have said that maybe the real stuff was taken to Ohio and fake debris were shown off at Texas. But I'm not inclined to believe that for several reasons, which, as I explain everything else, you'll see what I mean. But that's just a theory some people have had. I personally think that the debris was just taken straight to Texas as was ordered. We even have photographs of Marcel Sr. being in the Texas office with the general and other people showing off the parts. Makes you wonder, why would Marcel Sr. say that the debris were taken to Ohio instead of Texas? Well, it could have something to do with he was in his 70s when he gave that information out during an interview, and it had been almost 40 years since the actual incident itself. He probably was just misremembering. I'm sure he had been to several military bases, he'd done a lot, and he probably doesn't remember all the details. Certain details were probably pretty ingrained in his brain because the whole day was just weird and it was probably pretty incredible looking at that stuff. But I can see how he could have possibly misremembered where everything went. In the book The Roswell Legacy by Marcel Jr., which I read for this, he says that him and his dad didn't think that the photographed debris was the same as what they saw. Now, again, at least from Marcel Jr.'s perspective, he didn't see a whole lot of the debris, and it's possible that what was shown off and photographed weren't the same pieces that he saw. It's also possible that some of the more incriminating pieces that would have exposed Project Mogul were kept out of the press release and more basic weather balloon parts were shown. Witnesses who had a look at the debris before they went to the press release in Texas said that the photos were showing what was found in the New Mexico desert. So I don't know, kind of little back and forth there with are the parts real, are they not? It's very possible that some were switched out to conceal Project Mogul, but I don't think that the government was concealing aliens or alien crafts. Oftentimes in my readings, I found that military personnel and civilians alike, looking at the debris, weren't really able to determine what the debris was for, whether it was a weather balloon or a surveillance balloon. And I found that several people were saying that it should be obvious to identify parts of a weather balloon or even a surveillance balloon, at least for the military personnel. And a lot of people described the components looking very strange and alien, but doesn't that all kind of make sense if you have this secret surveillance balloon that has all these fancy components that you had several different researchers and scientists build to put everything together for this special mission? To me, it kind of makes sense that people would know what at least some of the parts were for. And these balloons were specifically designed for this high altitude and far travel to conduct their surveillance. So new stuff had to be created, new stuff had to be put together. This included polyethylene balloons that were laminated with aluminum. That gave a lot of the debris a metalish look, and why some people described it as tinfoil. And also, the fun fact about this kind of material, you could crumple it and it'll go back to its original shape when you let it go, just like what some witnesses described, like the Marcels. If something like that can be explained, then certainly something like the I-beam could be explained logically. Well, for that, I kind of found the explanation hard to believe. If you recall, the Marcels described this I-beam having some kind of indent that was pink or purplish in color, with these strange symbols that they described as hieroglyphics. This was apparently explained as tape, a specific type of tape that came from a toy manufacturer that had symbols on it that was similar to that pink purplish color, that was used to hold stuff together on the balloon. I know I said that this was some advanced project and all these unique pieces were put together, so I really doubt they'd be keeping it together with tape. It's probably the strangest part of this whole mystery for me. Marcel Jr. did create a sketch of the symbols some 40 years after the incident during an interview. I showed this earlier in the video. I'm going to show you again. These are the kind of symbols he recalls seeing. I don't really see how these symbols would be on a type of tape that a toy manufacturer makes, but it was also 40 years after the fact, or almost 40 years after the fact, so I wouldn't really 100% trust his memory on drawing out these symbols. Maybe they were actually alien symbols. But then again, with how everything else is going so far, this really does seem like a secret government project instead of something extraterrestrial. Let's move on from the Marcels, because there were other people that were a part of this story, like Sheriff Wilcox, who was allegedly threatened to keep quiet about everything. This information actually came from his granddaughter, Barbara, which was then contradicted by his daughter, Elizabeth, who said that he was never threatened. Rather, military personnel came over to him and told him, hey, can you just keep quiet about this while we're figuring everything out? As for the sheriff, he never mentioned ever being threatened by anybody. Then you have the rancher, Mac Brazel. He said that the night before this crash site was discovered, he heard a loud explosion that he wasn't familiar with. There were thunderstorms going on, and he had heard thunderstorms all the time. They happen all the time in the New Mexico desert. But he said this explosion sounded far different than thunder or lightning, hence why he went out the next day. He also didn't believe that the debris found was part of a weather balloon, mostly because he had seen weather balloons crash on the ranch prior, and none of the pieces made sense to him. In the Roswell Legacy book, Marcel Jr. talks about how Mac said that the debris was large and spread out through a vast area, and that the components were different than something used for a weather balloon. There were unfortunately no direct quotes, but that's what Marcel Jr. said that Mac had to say. And again, the different components could mean aliens, or it was just because it was a secret surveillance balloon. I even read about claims saying that the photographs taken of the debris were fake, or that the debris themselves were fake, which we talked about earlier. Comparing different photos of the debris that were taken by different photographers or the same photographer at different angles, everything looks the same. Some of the photos have been claimed to be real, while others were fake. Some of these fake photos look like the exact same stuff in the supposed real photos, so I think this is all just a bunch of crap misinformation the government's putting out to keep you off their back about the hidden aliens. The government has actually done that. Who's to say they didn't start here? It's kind of funny. It does make me wonder, when the balloon crashed and they figured out what the debris was the whole "we got a flying saucer" just a sensational cover story while they figured out a more rational one? Some witnesses and researchers point to the type of plane that was used to transport the personnel and debris as being too large. Why would they use something like that for weather balloon debris? They would use something like that if they were hauling something large, like, say, pieces of a crashed flying saucer. The plane I'm talking about is a Douglas C-54 Skymaster, a typical transport plane used by the military at that time. Whether you're transporting troops or equipment, it was used. People seem to often forget that the train of balloons for Project Mogul could be up to 650 feet long. That's a whole lot of debris when the balloons come crashing down. And sure, the debris is all lightweight, but when you have that much of it, you're going to use a large transport plane to carry everything, especially if it's the most commonly used one. They were moving personnel and the debris. It's kind of a no-brainer, and I don't really see this as an example as to why they were hauling alien parts instead of weather balloon parts. And Marcel Sr. did mention, I know I said I was done talking about them, but I forgot to mention this. Marcel Sr. mentioned, and so did other people, of this large, vast debris field. And, 650 feet of balloons coming crashing down with their equipment kind of makes sense why you'd have such a vast debris field, especially with the debris field seeming like it was traveling at a northeast to southwest direction. The balloons probably came crashing down in their little train bit, just slapping against the ground and parts going everywhere. It's entirely possible. High altitude crash, maybe the balloons failed and everything came down at terminal velocity. There wouldn't be an explosion, but you'd still get debris everywhere. Maybe some of the debris, being as light as it was just blown around by the wind. Then it would kind of make sense why everything would be pushed about. Just my thoughts. I'm kind of rambling at this point. Let's move on. In my readings and research, I often found a lot of second-hand and third-hand witness accounts of people who knew somebody or knew somebody who knew somebody that was either military personnel that were there or civilians that said that they saw something. And often from all these accounts, once again, you have people saying that they didn't know what the debris were and that the military personnel that saw it should have been familiar with it, but they weren't. Again, with the configuration of the surveillance balloons, I'm not surprised, and the secrecy around it, the majority of the military didn't know this was going on. Just the people doing it. Hell, some of the people that were even releasing these balloons thought they were just being used for weather surveillance. The US government was afraid of Soviet spies figuring out what they were trying to do, and if you're going to be testing your own super powerful weapons, you don't really want the other country to know that you have them or how far along you're coming. So it makes sense, all the secrecy and people not knowing. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse with mentioning this so many times. Now we get to the fun part. We can discuss the whole alien bodies being found at crash sites that were related to the Roswell incident, which we'll get into in just a minute. I just want to mention the body information stuff came out from interviews that occurred many years after the event itself, specifically around the 70s and 80s when interviews were being conducted. This came from first-hand witnesses, second-hand, and third-hand witnesses. Again, I don't really trust the second and third-hand witnesses because when you're playing a game of telephone with that much stuff, information's going to change and they're not very trustworthy. Plus, after so many years, people will forget details. Anyway, let's move on to the more interesting stuff. Oh wait, one more important note. The two original military personnel, Marcel Sr. and Cabot, were there to collect the debris, along with the rancher Brazel and the sheriff Wilcox. None of them ever mentioned anything about bodies. And it's important to make that note just because the body stuff was in reference to a Crash Site 1 and Crash Site 2, which I mentioned previously. I'm going to go over those now. For Crash Site 1, you have two witnesses, James Ragsdale and Trudy Truelove. They were out camping in the desert when, during the evening, they claimed to have seen something come crashing down some distance away. The following morning, they went to go investigate this crash landing. James described seeing a craft embedded in the ground with the bodies present. He didn't get too close because he couldn't identify if the bodies were real or if they were something like, say, dummies. James also claimed to have taken some of the debris from the crash, but him and Trudy couldn't stick around long because then the military rolled in to clean up the mess. This all sounds very fascinating and interesting, and you're probably wondering why I didn't include this in one of the prior sections. Well, James changed his story since his first telling, and he changed a couple of details, which kind of makes the whole story, at least to me, seem like bogus. If you recall, he saw bodies, and he said he took some of the debris. Well, later he, changing his story, stated that he got close enough to look into a window, and that's where he saw bodies, but then he also said he took 3 golden helmets off of the bodies. And if he was that close, and if he removed their helmets, how was he not able to tell if they were real or dummies? What also changed was the location of the crash site. He first said it happened at a ranch, kind of like where the debris field was found, except when that rancher was interviewed, he said he never knew anything about any strange crash sites on his property. But then why would James change his story? He could have just gone with that. You can see why I really don't believe his story. And he claimed several times to have taken parts of the crash, and yet he was never able to produce any of this debris for any kind of testing or examination by researchers or scientists. I mean, that would have been a really big piece of evidence, and yet he had nothing to present. And his alleged encounter and interviews happened some 50 years after the Roswell incident itself, so, why didn't he come out with this information initially? Maybe he was scared. Why is he doing it now? I don't know. I personally think he was just trying to interject himself in the whole Roswell incident story, make himself maybe famous, or maybe get a couple bucks out of it. I don't know. Maybe he just wanted some attention. The whole story just seems like a whole bunch of crap to me. But you can always let me know what you think in the comments. I'm not alone in this, by the way. Most ufologists who've looked into the Roswell incident don't buy James's story. With Crash Site 1 seeming to be a bust, we still have Crash Site 2, where the witness was a 5-year-old named Gerald Anderson, who claimed to have stumbled upon a crash site in the desert that, to him, he described it as looking like a blimp. Why was he out in the desert? Well, he was with his family. They were passing through the area. They made a stop, and I guess he wandered off. Why would you let your 5-year-old wander off? I don't know. I guess it was the 1940s, so times were safer. I don't know. Anyway, not the point. Gerald said he didn't get close to the crash site, but he observed it from a distance, and he could have sworn he saw figures that appeared to be bandaged. He couldn't tell if this was the crew of the crashed blimp-looking thing, or if they were something like plastic dolls. And then pretty soon military personnel rolled in and started cleaning up the area. And then I found some secondhand accounts that describe the crash site and the crew members in more detail, looking more alien, that kind of thing. But my only thing is, I couldn't figure out where those secondhand accounts came from. They certainly didn't come from Gerald, because he would have gotten closer and would have been able to give those same details that these secondhand accounts had. So I'm not really inclined to believe it. Gerald was interviewed several decades after the fact, and he was also 5 at the time, so to no surprise, I don't really trust his memory about what he saw exactly. And I mean, he even seemed unsure as to what he was looking at. And to no one's surprise, ufologists also don't really buy this story. We have 2 crash sites that don't really seem to be legitimate, or at least they have nothing to do with aliens. They certainly could have been actual sites where something crashed, just not something human or alien. Turns out the military did conduct high-altitude testing involving dummies that were human-shaped, and this went on from the mid-1940s to the 50s, 60s, and so on. Several different tests and experiments were done at various altitudes involving these dummies because it was a lot safer to throw a dummy out of a plane to test certain things than using human beings. Some of these dummies would be carried up to 90,000 feet in the air with these specific balloons that were used to transport them that high before a signal would be transmitted and then the dummies would be dropped. And oftentimes when these dummies were dropped, military personnel would soon show up to collect them because again, that data was important. This sounds kind of familiar with the two stories of military people rolling in to then clean everything up. Sometimes it took a little bit longer to find where the dummies crashed, and sometimes the dummies were never found at all. There were also witnesses who saw the dummies after they'd come crashing down, either before or during the military scooping them up. And this could have started some of the rumors of alien bodies around New Mexico. Just look at how some of these dummies were covered up in silver or black type bags that average civilians might have seen as body bags, wondering, what just fell out of the sky and what could the military possibly be taking away. The bags were used to protect any sensitive data from any heat or other elemental factors. If you're going to go through all that trouble to collect the data, then you're going to want everything to stay intact. Military personnel would also use stretchers or wooden boxes that maybe would be mistaken as caskets to transport the dummies. Again, witnesses might think that either some tragic accident happened, somebody died, or aliens crashed, and the military was covering it up. The dummies would also, to no surprise, get damaged from the falls, maybe losing a finger, an arm, maybe the head would get damaged in a way that would look kind of weird. So from a distance, people might assume aliens. It's a possibility. It's possible that James, Trudy, and Gerald may have just seen one of these dummy crashes that were then scooped up by the military. Without any more further detail or any physical evidence from them, it's kind of hard to prove that they saw anything that was extraterrestrial. Even the witnesses themselves weren't 100% sure with what they saw, which would make sense if this was some kind of secret military experiment or just testing new equipment that the civilian populace was just not familiar with. With all this talk of crash test dummies in the desert, what about that Roswell Army Airfield Hospital that apparently had alien bodies that were there for autopsy? Yeah, I didn't forget about that one. Let's get into that next. Glenn Dennis is our star witness for this one. He worked for a funeral home that the military would often also use. They called him up in July of 1947 and asked for several child-sized caskets, about 3, and they were to be dropped off at the Roswell Army Airfield Hospital. Glenn got the caskets together and drove over to the hospital, where he had some strange experiences. Firstly, in the parking lot, one of the military vans were open, and they had some kind of strange wreckage in the back of it, something that Glenn described as canoe-shaped with a purplish-pink color. It would later be described as maybe potentially some kind of alien escape pod. This strange piece of wreckage also had weird symbols on it, kind of making a callback to that strange I-beam that the Marcels saw. Glenn then went into the hospital where he saw a nurse that seemed upset or bothered by something. He was about to leave the hospital when he saw some military personnel that seemed to be acting a bit secretive about what they were doing. So he asked them a couple questions, and this is where he made a really big mistake. The military personnel weren't too keen on him asking questions or even looking around, so by force he was escorted off the hospital grounds. The following day, he was able to meet up with that nurse he saw that seemed upset about something, and she had a lot of extraordinary things to say. The nurse told him how military personnel had brought in 3 alien bodies for autopsy. She was instructed not to speak about the matter. And this is where she apparently made a mistake, because soon after this interaction with Glenn, the nurse would go missing. With not being able to find her or contact her again, Glenn assumed that she was probably silenced, maybe even killed by the government to keep her quiet. And then later he would claim that he received a letter from the nurse that came from London, which is where the nurse was apparently now staying. He tried to write back to her for more information, or maybe to see her again in person, but every letter he sent kept returning, and allegedly the letters would say that the nurse was now deceased. The letters also had no return address. Dennis told this story in the 1990s when he was interviewed. And it's important to note that Dennis is really the only witness we have for alien bodies being at that Roswell Army Airfield Hospital. And he also told a second-hand account that the nurse gave him, and that nurse could not be found. And when researchers went looking to see if she was ever employed at that hospital, no records could be found, which you could say that maybe the military just scrubbed her existence from their files. But I think it's more likely that Dennis isn't very credible. There were other doctors present. He even recognized two of the doctors, one of them being a pediatrician, that were in the hospital at the time, but nobody else could corroborate a story of alien bodies, and nobody mentioned anything about a missing nurse. Glenn also did not have any physical evidence of any of this being true. You're wondering, what could he have presented? Well, he could have presented the letter that the nurse allegedly sent him. And speaking of that nurse, I know I mentioned that maybe her files could have been scrubbed from that hospital by the government. And you're probably wondering, how do we know who to search for? Well, during a documentary, Glenn provided a name that was the nurse in question. And when this was looked into and nothing could be found, they then asked Glenn, hey, we couldn't really find anything on this woman. What do you think? And instead of saying something like maybe the government's covering something up, he literally told them, I gave you a fake name because I promised this woman I would protect her identity. But you're doing the interviews in the 90s, and this happened in the late 40s, and you're older now too. So she's probably dead by this point, because I assume the nurse was older than him, or who knows, maybe she's still alive and around his age. But I feel like at this point you can give the information. The government probably won't do too much about it, especially if it's out there. And if they were willing to make the nurse disappear, why weren't they willing to then also dispose of Glenn? To me, that didn't really add up. If they're willing to take out one to silence people, they're willing to take out more. It's not like they had to massacre the entire hospital staff. One nurse was talking, and one dude heard the information. They could also chalk him up as crazy, but there were never any real smear campaigns against this man, so I don't know. I find all of it hard to believe. I don't even believe Dennis when he says he saw that strange canoe-shaped wreckage that was pink or purplish with strange symbols. I think he might have been thinking about the I-beam, and he wanted his story to relate to that, so he mentioned also seeing something that was pink or purplish in color with strange symbols. That's just my opinion. I could be wrong on that. He could have actually seen some strange wreckage. Maybe it was from a military test that nobody knew about. Maybe dummies were involved. Maybe there was confusion. Maybe people thought there were bodies. I don't know. But what I do know is that there were some actual military plane crashes with injured pilots that were taken to the Roswell hospital, all bandaged up. And it's possible that maybe that could have spread rumors of alien bodies. It's a possibility. But as for Glenn Dennis's story, I really don't buy any of it. In my opinion, the Roswell incident as a whole had nothing to do with extraterrestrials, at least based on everything that I've found in my research. I believe that there was a whole lot of rumors and fabrication and excitement at that time and many years after, especially with the whole alien craze really picking up momentum. Some people, I think, just wanted to be part of the story, so they kind of gave exaggerated accounts. I believe that the witnesses for Crash Site 1 and 2 didn't make up the entire crash sites, they just made up certain details. And the same goes for Glenn Dennis. I think he actually went to that hospital and he was told to bring some caskets, but I don't think there was anything to do with alien autopsies. I mean, I guess it's a military hospital, so that's where you take them, but I feel like the government would have a more secretive facility to do that kind of autopsy rather than taking them to a hospital where several people would see them. They'd at least cover them up, you know? A random nurse wouldn't see them, and it's not like they need a nurse for dead bodies. At the time, in June, July-ish of 1947, late June, early July, you did have the sightings at Mount Rainier, which I will cover in a future video. I think that may have fueled excitement at the time, hence why all the craziness. When the debris was found, it also didn't help anything with the military saying, hey, we got a flying saucer. I would like to know your opinions, of course, in the comments, what you think of all this, if you think I'm wrong, if you have your own theories, or if you have anything interesting I can read about that could maybe further my knowledge on this topic. I'm also willing to change my mind if someone can present me with actual evidence that the Roswell incident was something extraterrestrial rather than just a regular government cover-up. Well, there you have it. That's the Roswell incident. It took me forever to get this out, partly because of the information and also partly because I don't always get a lot of time to work on these videos. I do work full-time and I like going outside and spending time with my family as well. I don't really like being inside. Granted, doing all the research and stuff is always fun. But anyway, next video will be out sooner, I promise. If any of you even care. And until next time, mammals, if you find yourself in a desert and you find what you believe to be a crashed alien saucer, maybe take some evidence and get it to some people to have it tested. Just, do it quickly. Apparently the military will then roll in which case you're probably going to disappear and we'll never hear from you again. Anyway, see you.